just start yawning and I will take a cue. But this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, emerging fungal pathogens. And I really want to talk about it from what we do in the lab, right? How are we diagnosing it? What are our challenges? So what I really want to take away from this presentation is that fungal pathogens are new. Dr. Hada and I were just discussing how these are sort of the forgotten pathogens and we don't really prioritize them, but we're seeing more and more of them come about as time goes on. And I'll sort of try to explain the key drivers of these emerging fungal outbreaks, identify some major fungal pathogens of concern and where the resistance and spread is coming from, describe some of the challenges that we're seeing in fungal diagnostics and how that impacts us, and then recognize some evolving lab roles and public health collaborations for outbreak preparedness. So, erosion of resistance to fungal disease. Now, our resistance to fungal disease is really based on two pillars. One of them is just our body temperature. Fungi love colder places. This is why they grow on the bread left in my cool kitchen, right? And so they just enjoy those temperatures. And the fact that our body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, that really prevents us from being susceptible to these fungal pathogens. However, with climate change, a lot of these fungal organisms are adapting and evolving to develop this, get past this barrier. So they're adapting, their geographic range is expanding based on these temperature changes. There's also our host susceptibility that's changing. There's some studies out there that's saying our body temperature is dropping a little bit by decades. And then there's just disruption in the environmental health. The other challenge on the other pillar on the other side is really advanced immunity, right? So we're seeing a lot of nosocomial spread. If you think about it, a decade ago, we weren't even doing antifungal susceptibility testing on yeast. And now we think we have to do it for mold, right? So we've come a long way where all of this is changing. Antifungals are being utilized more and more in our patient population. So that's also leading to our sort of these barriers sort of breaking and us increasing our resistance, dropping our resistance to fungal disease. Now, one of the sort of warning signs, I would say, has been Candida auris, right? We didn't even know about it before 2016, which, can you imagine, that's almost a decade ago now? Crazy. But we didn't even know about it. Candida auris didn't exist. I started at Cleveland Clinic in 2022, and we had no Candida auris cases in Cleveland Clinic until 2022. That is how non-prevalent it was. But Candida auris is really a canary in a coal mine that was sort of warning us of these antifungal, new fungal organisms that are coming about. It came across in 4 different places at the same time. And some of it is really believed to be this adaptation to the environment, because it seems to have started in the ear, which is why auris, right? Actually, I was recently in Korea giving a similar talk where they said all of their Candida auris infections are not blood or candidemia cases that we see here. All of them are limited to the ear because of the clade that they have, because it really does prefer the coldest part of your body, which is really your ear. It doesn't really get into your intestines or like deeper invasive infections. So it's really kind of interesting how it sort of evolved and adapted, and really the different clades seem to have very different susceptibility patterns and even infection patterns. But Candida auris brought with it high mortality risk. It has a high environmental resilience, right? But there's all of these contact precautions and things when you do detect Candida auris. And then it is also multi-drug resistance. For the first time, we were seeing yeast that were resistant to azoles, even echinocandins, and sometimes even amphotericin. This tracks Candida auris within the US. As you can see, there were really no cases prior to 2016. Can you guys see the, yeah? Okay, I just can't see it, so I won't use it. In 2016. But in 2018, that star, that's really where the CDC decided that it would start making Candida auris nationally reportable. And that is really where you start seeing that jump in cases, right? Because now not only was every state required to report it, there was also more diagnostic testing going on in order to be able to identify it. I'm sure you've seen reports of how Candida auris was previously misidentified with a lot of other Candidas, like Candida parapsilosis sometimes, because of the biochemical testing and all of the other targets we had. But the earliest Candida auris detection was found in 1996, once they went back and were able to do a historical sequencing of Candidas that they had stocked. And there was one case in South Korea, very few cases prior to 2010. And then 2013 to 2015, we had 9 US clinical cases. And now we've jumped up to somewhere close to 10,000, right? Now, this is where diagnostics plays a huge role. Is it really that we have a lot more Candida auris? Yes, that is correct. But we also have better diagnostics tools to be able to identify this. 2018 marked when Bruker and Vitek, so our big MALDI-TOF instruments, inserted Candida auris spectra into their databases. So then it was our easiest identification method and was most accurately able to identify Candida auris. 2019, CDC started their PCR protocol for swabs. But then the other big change was in 2020 when molecular panels became available in order for us to be able to identify Candida auris from candidemia cases. And that really changed how quickly we were able to identify invasive Candida auris infections and not just surveillance cases, right? 2021, there was a Chromauger Candida Plus. How many of you guys are using Chromaugers for Candida auris? Anyone? No. Well, I'll tell you my story. We were not using Chromaugers for Candida auris, and we are not a surveillance hospital. So Cleveland Clinic does not believe in doing surveillance for Candida auris. Now, we can debate this, and that will be another talk. Please invite me back. But we were not using Chromaugers for Candida auris. However, it was becoming really, really challenging to be able to identify Candida auris, especially when we saw our cases essentially quadrupling within a year. So from 2022 to 2023, our cases doubled and then it tripled. And now so because of that, we implemented Chromauger Candida auris in order to be able to identify Candida auris easily instead of having to try and MALDI 6 different colonies, right? Our lab staff wasn't very happy about that. Well, with the implementation of this Chromauger, we now identify Candida auris in a lot of cases where we previously wouldn't have. From wounds, from back swabs, from locations that are likely not pathogenic, probably just colonization, but we are identifying them. And then in 2024, Diasora and Candida auris direct detection. Is anyone using that? Do you guys do any surveillance for Candida auris here? No? Okay. Interesting. But yeah. Yeah, like I said, topic for another day. But yes, our Candida auris cases for that reason have gone up. But this exponential increase in cases, you can also see how all of these factors have probably played a huge role in then diagnosing these cases, right? The more tools we have available, the better diagnosticians we are because we're able to detect it. So even though Candida auris to me is the canary in the coal mine that's sort of bringing all of this about, there's a lot of other uncommon Candida species that we tend to see across the world. In Pakistan, just last year, they reported this huge breakout with Candida blankii, which is a very close relation to Candida auris. And so we're seeing all of these new Candida species come about. Some of them are in our databases, some of them are not. Some of them are causing breakouts in places that we're not familiar with, okay? But some of them are really new names. However, some of them are not. Have you guys seen any, have identified Candida bracharensis or niviarensis or heard of these before? I see some nods. No. These all belong to one Candida complex. And I'm sure when I say it, any guesses as to which one? Well, they all actually belong to the Candida glabrata complex. And we all know Candida glabrata, right? But more and more, we're seeing these cryptic Candida glabrata species, Candida niviarensis and Candida bracharensis, that are causing infections. And as soon as we were able to start molding them, we're sort of seeing them more and more. So something to keep in mind. Now, that brings me to a very important topic of fungal taxonomy. Who loves fungal taxonomy here? Yeah? Yeah. You can have my job. I do not. It makes it really hard, right? To keep these in a part, especially Candida. How many, in order for something to be a genus, it has to be a manageable amount of species within that genus. Candida breaks that rule 1,000 times over. Agreed? So because of that, fungal taxonomy is really hard. And we're not even talking about molds yet. We're just talking about yeast, right? But how many of us and how many of our clinicians know all of these species named as Candida glabrata? And as soon as you throw in Nacasiomyces, they're going to go, what is that? Right? So that makes it really challenging. And so that makes it really hard because it doesn't feel like we're speaking the same language anymore. And it doesn't matter what we report out. If the other person on the other side does not understand it and has to go Google it or chat GPT it, that's a problem. So we all need to be speaking the same language. And I think this paper does a really good job of combining a bunch of stakeholders to try and really put this into effect. And actually in our lab, we've started using this website, Atlas of Clinical Fungi, that we use in order to make sure our reporting is consistent. It also is a really good tool for our lab staff because they can use it. Not only does it provide the appropriate, most updated species name or genus name, it also tells them what the macroscopic morphology should look like and just little interesting tidbits. So it's actually become a really good learning tool that we've implemented. But we actually use this quite a bit in order to stay consistent because it is really hard to keep up with fungal taxonomy. But because of that, if you go to Atlas of Clinical Fungi and you type all of these in, it actually tells you what members of the complex it is. So it tells you it's within the Candida glabrata species complex. It also tells you on that right-hand side that this is up for debate and it might transition to Nacasiomyces at some point, but hasn't done so currently. When that day comes, we will report it as such. But that's where we are. So I think this is really helpful. This is how we've been keeping up. And like I said, it's been a really great tool for our lab that we've implemented. Now, you might say, okay, great. You're telling me about these Candida glabrata species. What does it matter? Is the clinician going to change anything? Does it matter that it's Candida niviarensis and Candida bracharensis? And it kind of does, okay? With Candida glabrata, we already know it's not as good a friend to us as Candida albicans is, okay? We see more resistance in Candida glabrata. About 10 to 15% of them tend to be fluconazole resistant, and some have cross resistance. Candida glabrata is one of our most common yeasts that we see in our lab that sort of has echinocandin and fluconazole resistance at the same time. And then, but Candida glabrata to me is also one of the most well-characterized genotypic-phenotypic correlation with resistance. Candida niviarensis is actually frequently resistant to fluconazole and voriconazole. So it's important to know that, right? If you think of it as just Candida glabrata, you might think it might be susceptible to fluconazole and voriconazole when it's really not. And it's often misidentified as Candida glabrata and often investigated after treatment failures. Candida bracharensis tends to be a little bit more similar to Candida glabrata in terms of azole resistance. It remains susceptible to echinocandin as far as we know. But it is this rare but emerging resistance pattern that we're learning more and more about as we see more and more cases come up, okay? Now, it's well and good to know that some of these organisms can develop resistance or have resistance and what percentage, but this can vary. And in some of your patient population, you might see more resistance because of their exposure to azoles previously. So who does yeast susceptibility testing in-house? Okay. Y11, I'm assuming. Y4. Okay. But broth microdilution, colorimetric broth microdilution. Okay. Who loves it? Okay.
It's better than e-test.
It's better than an e-test. And it's amazing because my lab staff will tell me, because we have bacteriology that's completely diffusion and e-tests, and they'll say, well, why can't we bring this on for yeast? And I was like, have you ever tried to do e-tests and diffusion with yeast or mold? It is really hard. It is not as easy to read. But you can say the same thing for these colorimetric panels, right? They are, I would say, less subjective than broth microdilution. We currently did our Y11 with just straight broth microdilution as our gold standard testing. And some organisms were easier to read without that color because you don't see that trailing. You're not seeing all of the light purple, right? When they ask you, when you're trying to train a new person, what is purple and what is blue and what's lavender? That makes it really hard. But these are really hard to interpret. We see a lot of trailing with our Candida tropicalis. That's one of our most problematic organisms, where we see a lot of trailing in our azoles. And based on our data, we saw that before we trained our staff, we were overcalling resistance for azoles. And here's the challenge with overcalling resistance, especially in these. There's not that many antifungals. There's azoles, there's echinocandins, and then there's amphotericin. If we're overcalling azole resistance, we've already knocked out one big gun, right? So this is why we've actually put in a lot of time this past year to train, especially we've had a lot of turnover and new staff to read these panels. But gradient diffusion isn't expensive, but it can really be a lot more challenging. Can you imagine reading this and then reading this? Right? So all of them sort of come with their own limitations. There is improved discrimination between true resistance and trailing growth. That is the advantage with e-tests, but it's really not available for all antifungals because most people are not doing it. In broth microdilution, you can test all antifungals at one time, right? Instead of having various different plates. So there is an ease of use there. Now, MICs don't actually tell the whole story either because we don't have breakpoints for all of these organisms, right? Has anyone implemented ECVs here? That's my new favorite question to ask. You have. Let's have a conversation. Because I will tell you this. When we were switching over to Y11, I created this, I think, beautiful table that showed how many yeast organisms have breakpoints and how many more of them have ECVs, but no breakpoints. And what does it mean when you're just reporting out an MIC and giving them a number? It tells you nothing. And comparing a Candida glabrata MIC to a Candida parapsilosis MIC is not the same thing. That's apples to oranges, but it doesn't feel that way, right? It's like 1 pound and 2 kilograms. But when you start getting into the discussion of the nitty-gritty understanding of ECVs, it is really, really hard because you need these ECVs understood not just by infectious disease, but a lot of other stakeholders who find it quite challenging because you can't just call it resistant. ECVs don't say resistant or susceptible. They're saying this is wild type and this is non-wild type. And it became so much of a hurdle that we just decided today was not the day to cross that bridge. Okay? So these are hard. So there's limited clinical breakpoints. One of the other things that I find quite frustrating is that most of our resistance that we see, at least in Cleveland Clinic, and I'm sure is true for you as well, is in vaginal candidiasis, okay? If we were to create our antibiogram, 90% of our Candida albicans are susceptible, but within that 10% that's resistant, almost 90% of them are from vaginal candidiasis, okay? But pH plays a huge role in azole activity, and we don't test for that. We're just testing it and saying it. So does it clinically matter? To be honest with you, I don't know. But we're not testing for that, and we're not seeing how pH, our vaginal pH, is impacting that azole activity, and if that's why we're seeing an ineffect of the azole treatment. All right, we already covered limited breakpoints. There's also weak correlation with clinical outcomes. Some species show variable or unstable resistance profiles. So it's really great, right, when we're talking about resistance and we can do genotypic testing to say this phenotype is related to this genotype. Well, with yeast, that's really, really hard. With azoles, we have certain hotspots. With echinocandins, we have certain hotspots. Amphotericin, it seems to be, efflux pumps and changes and cell walls thickening. It's really hard to figure out a direct mechanism of resistance there. So it's really hard to correlate the two. And then there's limited use and understanding of ECVs, which is also something that we talked about. And they're not universally available or reported either. I think CAP recently, 2 years ago, published that less than 10% of labs were actually using ECVs for that reason. Okay, let's come back to Candida auris for a second. We've had it, everyone's seen it, everyone's diagnosing it, but up until recently, and maybe this year, there actually haven't been published breakpoints in CLSI for Candida auris. We've been using CDC published breakpoints, but they're not within our documents to say this is truly susceptible or resistant. The other thing is, there are ECVs that are proposed by certain studies, but in this graph, what this shows you is that based on the different clades, there's actually variable resistance. So the CDC says there's 90% resistance of fluconazole in Candida auris, okay, as like a wide statement. And that is because most of the clade that we have within the US, clade 1 is 90% resistant to azoles. But if you had the East Asian clade or the South American clade, now your fluconazole resistance is a lot lower. And you're not really seeing the same resistance there, right? But we're barely just figuring out how to diagnose Candida auris. We're definitely not figuring out how to go down to the clade level without sequencing. So susceptibility testing then plays a huge role in helping us determine whether it is truly susceptible or resistant to azoles. And then, like I said, this really matters. And the reason that I bring it up in Candida auris is because if it's 90% resistant to azole, and you have about 2 to 8% that are resistant to echinocandins, then you're essentially only left with the big gun, amphotericin, right? And some of these are even resistant to all of these. There's about 50% that are resistant to not 2 drugs, but 2 drug classes, right? So that's quite a bit, and about 4% are pan-resistant. So we talked about new stuff, but here's what's interesting about yeast. These are our known foes. We have Candida albicans that used to be 90% of the infections caused within the US. But now, when we're looking at these drug-resistant Candida species causing candidemia, Candida albicans is now only responsible for about 37% from the last CDC data. And now you're seeing more and more of Candida glabrata, Candida parapsilosis, Candida tropicalis, which is why susceptibility testing is becoming more and more important, because now you're not just being exposed to Candida albicans with known susceptibilities, but all of these other organisms where susceptibility testing is needed. And what I find even more interesting is that this is really a worldwide issue. In Candida parapsilosis, using this as an example, in North America, about 10 to 15% of our cases are because of Candida parapsilosis. And I'm talking candidemia cases only. However, in Latin America, it's about 40%. In Africa, it's more than 50%. So it's overtaken Candida albicans in its prevalence. What we're finding out as we learn more about candidemia cases is that in Candida parapsilosis tends to be more prevalent in worlds where there's more neonate population, a younger population. Candida glabrata seems to be more prevalent in places where you have an older population, right? And it's interesting why that's happening. We're learning more about it as we go, but we're learning as we go. None of these are known facts, right? What a world we live in. Job security, I say. But This is interesting. And even the 10 to 15% in North America is a very recent, I mean in the last decade, change, okay? Now, only 37% of the isolated Candida parapsilosis strains were shown to be susceptible to any of the azoles. Now, that's a little scary too. So Candida parapsilosis has been around. It's not Candida auris. All of us know it. All of us have diagnosed it. But we're seeing more and more resistance, even with a known yeast. This is US data. Between 2009 and 2010, only 5% of our Candida parapsilosis, less than 5%, were resistant to azoles. But from 2015 to 2017, that's doubled. 10.6% of our isolates are resistant to azoles. Now, I did my PhD, actually I did my master's in quasi-species, how you put pressure on and everything sort of evolves. The real-time evolution, I think, is so cool. That's really what got me interested in science. And that's really what's happening in our patients when we're treating them with any sort of drugs, right? And so this study, I really like this study. Based on what you're using as a prophylaxis, you are then selecting that bug. So if there was no antifungal prophylaxis given, Candida albicans remains your most prevalent organism. But if fluconazole is given, I'm looking at the bottom one here. If fluconazole is given, now you're reducing the prevalence of Candida albicans, and you're seeing more Candida tropicalis, Candida glabrata, the organisms that are more resistant to fluconazole, right? And then if you give an echinocandin, now you're seeing Candida glabrata take over. No surprise there. Sort of makes sense, right? Intuitively. And that is really what we're seeing in our patient population. On the top graph, it shows you how many days of prophylaxis also makes a difference in selecting for the population. So if it's less than, say, 7 days, Candida albicans still remains your most prevalent population. But antifungal prophylaxis, if given for greater than 7 days, then you sort of see that variability of yeast species go up, right? And if you think about your transplant patients, they're in prophylaxis for a lot longer than 7 days, right? Pulmonary fibrosis, more of these diseases that are coming up, these patients tend to be on prophylaxis for a lot longer than seven days. IDSA guidelines, none of them say 7 days, okay? So that makes it really challenging, and that makes it really important for us to know these known yeast organisms, but now they're causing these more prevalent diseases. Now, Candida parapsilosis, as you can tell, I really like Candida parapsilosis. Candida parapsilosis has really caused multiple outbreaks around the globe. This is the data from a US hospital where they saw their fluconazole resistance go up from 14% to 34%, and they couldn't figure out why. It was surprising, right? They're looking at this data, and at first they were like, well, maybe it's Candida auris, but Candida auris has been around. That's not really impacting it. And it turns out that it was fluconazole resistant Candida parapsilosis in Georgia, where they had multiple outbreaks in multiple different hospitals in Georgia. And it was really only investigated after the public health looked into it. It also shows you the importance of public health, right? It doesn't change the antibiogram of that one single hospital, maybe not that much. But if you look at it as a whole, you're seeing this huge 14% to 34% increase because of this organism. Now, following this or alongside this, there have been several other cases where we're seeing these nosocomial spread of Candida parapsilosis. There is no contact precaution when it comes to Candida parapsilosis. There's not a red flag that goes up in EPIC when you isolate Candida parapsilosis. Nothing cool happens. It's not Candida auris. But it's also just as prevalent, maybe not just as prevalent, that's too strong of a statement, but it can last, and it does cause nosocomial outbreaks. And it can gain resistance to fluconazole pretty quickly. All right, I'm gonna switch gears. Anyone bored yet? Anyone want me to shut up? Okay. All right, I'm gonna switch over to molds. I've scared you enough with yeast, so we'll switch over to the other side. Now mold, how many of you guys identify molds? Used to. Okay. And is it all through lactophenol? Lactophenol. Mostly lactophenol. Okay. Takes them forever to grow, right? Almost all of them. All right, let's talk about these cases. So mucormycosis 2019 to 2021. Does anyone know about this outbreak in Arkansas? So this was an outbreak in Arkansas hospitals. They couldn't figure out where it was coming from. They had multiple patients in multiple different units getting mucormycosis. At first, they didn't even realize there was an association, but it was limited to this one hospital, and they just couldn't figure it out. They sequenced all of these mucor and they figured out, well, it has to be a nosocomial spread somehow because they're really not that different. Mortality was 38% with 25% discharge to hospice. That is a scary, scary number. And even after knowing this and all of the investigation that they did, they could never figure out the true source of this mucormycosis. They thought it was their cleaning supplies. They thought it was the laundry. Because if you think about it, if you swab this table right now, there might be mucor here. Okay? It was really hard to figure out the source, and they actually were never able to. Scary, right? There's another, does anyone know about this one? Fusarium meningitis. This one was a little bit more popular. It was spread from Mexico to Texas. Mortality was 50%, very high, but meningitis cases. And the way that it was really helpful in diagnosing was using the emerging infections network. Has anyone heard of this? Now, in Mexico, they were seeing these cases, and at first, they didn't really have a diagnosis, so they didn't know what was going on. This emerging infections network is sort of the way the clinicians speak to each other and trying to figure out in real time what's going on if there's a diagnosis. So when these infections were seen in Texas as well, that's really when they were like, let's all talk to each other and let's figure it out, right? Because not all of us are doing mold identifications or are able to get it to this genus or even the species. So this is, again, where public health becomes really important and this communication becomes really important because these organisms don't know geographical boundaries, okay? All right, so now that I've scared you, let me tell you a story from our lab. This was something that we saw in our lactophenol cotton blue from a transplant patient that we identified this from. Looks like an Aspergillus fumigatus, right? Okay. We actually use mold moldy in our lab to get a secondary confirmation. And mold moldy was something we implemented because we had a lot of turnover and we didn't have a lot of people trained on lactophenol cotton blue. And it is a really hard skill to learn. It really is. And so we were sort of using mold moldy as a way to teach ourselves, right? It's really nice when you can get a lactophenol cotton blue and then you can moldy it and get an idea and go, oh, this is what fumigatus looks like, or this is what fusarium looks like, right? And so that's really how we're using it. So our initial identification is through lactophenol cotton blue, and then we go to mold moldy. But what that means is we hold on to our cultures a lot longer then, right? Because we're waiting for lactophenol and then we have to moldy. Sometimes moldy doesn't work, then you have to remoldy. The rule is to do 2 moldies and then talk to me. So our lab scientists identified this Aspergillus fumigatus, reported it out. And then when she was going to do moldy, she saw those big balls. Do you know what those are? Anyone know what those are? Those are cleistothecias. Guess what? Aspergillus fumigatus does not produce them. So then that's when she called me and she said, I think I reported this wrong. This is not Aspergillus fumigatus, but this looks like Aspergillus fumigatus. She's like, no. It could be Aspergillus glaucus that produces cleistothecias, but it does not look like Aspergillus glaucus, okay? So we moldied it. We have that tool. And we got Aspergillus here at Suke. Anyone heard of this one? Neither had I. So I looked it up, okay? Rare cases, recently occurring cases. You see a lot of recent case reports with Aspergillus here at Suke, but it matches. It looks like Aspergillus fumigatus. It is almost always reported as Aspergillus fumigatus if you're not using any other identification methods. And it does produce cleistothecies, but guess what? It doesn't produce cleistothecies until it's been just held in culture for a little while and it's happy. So you get these misidentifications. Now I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked you with Candida glabrata and Bracharensis and Niviarensis. Does it matter? I'll tell you right now, Aspergillus hiratsuke belongs to the Aspergillus fumigati section. Does it matter that's hiratsuke? Does the cryptic species matter? You guys are right. You don't know. You don't know. I don't know. And so here's the thing. This is the Aspergillus fumigatus section. You have Aspergillus fumigatus, so fumigatus sensu stricto, so strictly only Aspergillus fumigatus, is the most common worldwide. But about 5 to 10% are reported out as Aspergillus fumigatus when they truly are these cryptic species. We've all heard about how Aspergillus fumigatus has increasing resistance to azoles, but these Aspergillus that belong to the section Fumigatii often inherently or have uncharacterized resistance not just to the azoles, but also to amphotericin B, which is what you would use, right, for any invasive infection. And then for diagnosis, LP-lactophenol is great for Aspergillus fumigatus, but all of these cryptic species look very similar, so it's really hard to identify them unless you have an alternative method, which most labs do not, okay? So within these cryptic species, Aspergillus lentulus, Uragave, Thermomutans, Hiratsuke, these are some of the most common ones that we're seeing show up in case reports in immunocompromised populations as we're building our diagnostic profile and tools for identifying these. Now, this patient had endocarditis. When we went back and looked at the surge path, you could probably see these cleistothecies in the surge path in the endocarditis case, but no one was looking for them, right? When they saw them, all you would call it is septate hyphae. We reported out Aspergillus fumigatus. They were like, everything matches up. We're done with the case. But there were clues in there, but Aspergillus in general is really hard to diagnose. And that's sort of hard to believe because we see these cases all the time. But how often? We just had a conversation with our transplant specialist where we report out Aspergillus fumigatus in cultures, and they're like, we don't care. We never know if it's real or if it's a contaminant. And that's true, right? Aspergillus fumigatus is one of our most common contaminants. And it's hard, especially when all of the other testing isn't quite confirmatory. Galactomannan only has a 40 to 60%, especially if it's a localized infection, right? You're just not going to see that galactomannan positivity, even though we sort of treat it like it would be. Now, plasma serum-free DNA testing, that's great. Mucor, for Mucor, it's beautiful. Greater than 90% sensitivity. We ask our ID team to order it. It's not available as an in-house test, but that's something we feel pretty confident about sending out when needed. But for a plasma serum test, if Aspergillus comes back as negative, that's not a great negative predictive value. I can't tell you for sure that it's not Aspergillus. There are targeted PCRs and there's histopath and FFPE testing. Now, all of these have variable sensitivity. So these are hard diagnostics. This is hard to diagnose. Has anyone looked at the IDSA guidelines for aspergillosis? It has a lot of probable maybes, maybe this, possible this. It's hard. Okay. The other thing is there have been a lot of reports from the WHO and even the CDC where we're seeing resistance when Aspergillus fumigatus go up to the point that we're saying that Aspergillus fumigatus should be set up for susceptibility testing, especially in our immunocompromised patient population, because you don't know. A recent publication said even in the US, about 1 to 3% of our Aspergillus fumigatus tend to be resistant to azoles, which wasn't the case previously. And now all of these seem to be coming from the environment. We've developed a case curriculum for climate change and how climate and our environmental practices tend to impact microbes. And they really do. And that's something I'm really passionate about. Again, another talk for another day. But the mutations that we see in Aspergillus out in the world, out in the community, out in the farms, are the same mutations that we see in our patient population when they're developing resistance to azoles. And that's because there are not that many antifungals. The antifungals that are being used out in the environment are the same antifungals that we're using in our patients. So because of that, now mold susceptibility testing is becoming more and more common and more needed than it used to be. Aspergillus species, it's recommended for testing. Scedosporium tends to be resistant, and we kind of know that, but it's also recommended for testing. Fusarium, recommended for testing because we don't know that much about it. And there seems to be that MICs don't really correlate with clinical outcomes. Now that's really hard. You're going to send it out for susceptibility testing, and when they call me to say, what does this MIC mean? I say, I don't know. Are you going to treat them? Because we're still learning, right? We haven't been doing this. We've just made it somewhat of a routine practice, and it's not in-house. It's all send out. Eucharalis, we actually don't recommend we send it out at CCF. If we get a request for it, I try to send them a lot of publications before we agree to sending it out because it just doesn't correlate well. And by the time you get these susceptibilities back, you would have started the patient on a treatment anyway because it's a very fast disease, right? Dematiaceous mold, now this one we never send out. And I joke that if you ever ask me to send out a dematiaceous mold, that Dr. Wiederhold is probably going to laugh at me for sending it to him. But I said that, and then we send out a recent codified law for a Bantiana case because it was needed, right? So there are certain dematiaceous molds that we don't expect to cause phaeohyphomycosis, but when they do, we would send it out. But there is a lot of lack of sort of clinical correlation with these MIC values. And then dermatophytes are not routinely tested, but again, there was a recent, within the last decade, there's been publications of terbinafine resistance. I was talking to someone in Canada where they have where they test everything, every dermatophyte, especially the trichophytans on agar plates to look for resistance because they have that much of it. Okay. Now, I've sort of mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. There's very few diagnostic tools out there that help us correlate genotypic mutations with phenotypic susceptibility testing, which makes it really hard, right? We don't have anything like a Carba5 for yeast where we can say, it has a NDM, don't bother. So that's really hard. There are certain mutations that are very well known, especially in Candida glabrata, that we can point towards saying that, okay, this is going to be resistant to echinocandins, but really not for anything else. Same thing, there are not a lot of antifungals like we talked about. There are a lot of antifungals that are coming down the pipeline, right? And it's important that we have them because we are seeing these cases more and more, and we are seeing more and more resistance. I'll tell you the scary part, so I'm just going to jump right to it. Has anyone heard of this drug, iplofenaquin? I'm not even sure that's how you really say that, but I think that's it. So this is a fungicide that's routinely used out in the environment. Has anyone heard of olorofin? Right, new antifungal. It's sort of been advertised quite a bit. Everyone was really excited about it. Well, because of this fungicide use of iplofenaquin, we're actually seeing those mutations cause resistance when utilizing olorofilm. And it's not even, this was before it was even widely available or being utilized at all. Yeah. Scary, right? And it's needed, right? Fusarium's killing all our bananas. My 2-year-old's not going to be very happy about that. So it's I don't like bananas. She does. So we have a banana dessert, right? I think I heard that. Yeah. So that's kind of scary that before we even start using it in our patient population, we're already seeing these resistance develop. Now, this is the first time that anyone's even paid attention to fungi, right? We had WHO priority list for bacteria for a long, long time. And it is just recently, what was the show? Yes, thank you. Maybe that's why. But fungi are scary. We have these critical group of fungi with Cryptococcus, Candida auris, Aspergillus fumigatus, and Candida albicans is on there because we are seeing resistance in Candida albicans that we didn't used to expect. But now there's a high priority group and a medium priority group. So I think fungi are finally seeing the limelight, but it is a little bit scary. And I think that puts the burden on us to develop better diagnostic tools to be able to identify these. Do you guys see a lot of dimorphic infections here? Kind of, somewhat. What do you see most of? Histoblasto? Histo? Okay. You see cocci? Wow. Interesting. So I'll tell you, at Cleveland Clinic, we have a histo growing at essentially all times, okay? However, what really throws us up for a loop is when it's anything besides histo. Because we're just not expecting it. Diagnostically, they're not expecting it. We're not expecting it in the lab. We've had 2 cocci in our lab in the 3 years that I've been there, and both times it's resulted in exposures because we're just not looking for it. And the patient, one of the cases, the patient didn't divulge that they lived in Arizona for 10 years of their life, right? And that happens. They don't know that cocci's there, and they should have told someone that. And so that happens, and that makes it really hard, right? We're also seeing these geographic boundaries. Do you know how these geographic boundaries were drawn initially? They used to do a skin test. You know, like the TB skin test? That's what they used to do for histo and blasto. And that's how they came up with these geographical boundaries of the Mississippi River and, you know, everything that we learned for boards of where these organisms belong. But like I said, they don't read the same books and they don't take boards like us, so they don't know where they're supposed to stay. And so because of this, you see a lot more cases, and this paper sort of shows that you see more and more of these cases. But here's the thing. Some people will argue that these are not really shifting geographic boundaries, that you just travel a lot more these days. And that is probably true, okay? I'm here, and I'm going back to Cleveland tomorrow, right? It is easier to travel, and it is easier to cross those geographical boundaries, but guess what? We don't, diagnostically, when a patient is being seen, you're not always thinking of those. A lot of these dimorphic cases, they've shown that 40% of cases are missed on the initial visit because they're just not suspecting it to be that. Unless you're in those endemic regions, right? No one in Iowa is going, let me test you for histoplasma. It's probably being sent to a reference lab, right? We don't do cocci testing in Cleveland. We send it to ARUP probably because they have it. So that makes it really hard to get these diagnosed. But we are sort of seeing this geographical expansion, not just with the dimorphic fungi, but some of these other ones across the world and not just within the United States, and mostly impacting immunocompetent hosts. And because of this, there's a fungal disease consortium that have really sort of tried to prioritize diagnostics for fungal organisms to sort of highlight how much of this is really needed. This is really where mold malady and all of that has sort of come into play because early diagnosis is really, really important. Histoplasma, even in cases that we know it's histoplasma, it takes us about 3 weeks to grow it. So it's hard to get confirmation, or if the patient's failing treatment, to grow it and then send it out for susceptibility testing. So direct identification from FFPE tissues, mold identification, mold blood cultures, right? Isolator tubes. Anyone remember when isolator tubes were discontinued? How do you expect us to diagnose histoplasma, right? Fungal point of care test, I don't think there is such a thing currently, but I think it's needed. Cystic fibrosis fungal cultures, we see a lot of odd bugs there. Antifungal susceptibility testing, making it more accessible. All right, I think I've talked your ear off. So I will close it off by saying, I hope what I've shown you with this presentation is that fungi are scary, but I think there's a lot that's been done for us to learn about it. The only reason I can give you this presentation is because we've been working on it for a long time to learn about these cases and learn from the cases that we're seeing on a daily basis to really improve our knowledge of these fungal diseases, because I think they're becoming more and more common. And so that makes it really important for us to expand diagnosis, integrate our testing, strengthen stewardship of testing, build networks, right? I can tell you right now that even with all of the histoplasma we see, it's not quite enough to be able to validate any testing. I typically have to collaborate with others who see histoplasma to be able to bring about a test that I think would be worth making clinically available. And then adapt strategies. So let's not let the fungal threats mold the future. All right. That's it for me. Thank you, everyone. Yes. Hmm?
So my question is, you said you use the mold ID on the Moldy as a teaching source. What, I think there may be a misconception, maybe on my end or my team's end, and we're thinking, okay, when we get the Moldy, we can use it because everyone's losing their, as you said, getting new people in and kind of using it as the primary ID. Do you ever see that coming, and when and why? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. Actually, it's one of my goals for this year to implement. So the way that we're currently doing our mold extractions is really cumbersome, and it's not really translatable from one lab to the other. So much so that we have 3 moldy instruments. All of them have 3 different lasers. I never thought I would need to go back to physics lessons, but just to learn that the 3 different laser strengths can really impact the way that these proteins are acquisitioned. And therefore, these 3 different moldy instruments, all Bruker, tend to give us very different results on moldy, which is really challenging, right? Talk about equipment comparison. So because of that, I think there are better ways to do it. I think the extraction that we're doing right now is too much. So we plan to change that this year. And it's really, if you look into the science of how Vitek or Bruker has developed their spectrums, they've done broth cultures. Bruker did broth cultures to build their spectra. Who's doing broth cultures for mold? Nobody. Okay, that makes it really hard. So then the spectra you're getting from your plates is very different. You have to make sure that your lab staff knows to get to the mycelia and how to get to it. Dematiaceous molds don't work because they have melanin and that interferes. So I think there are better methods out there. I have personally tried it, and I think there are easier ways to do mold extraction. And I think what we need to do is make moldy more accessible so that every single lab can do it, kind of like how we're doing bacteriology, than this, tube extraction and figuring out what moldy instrument you have. And it's challenging because of the fungal cell wall, essentially. So if you let the mold go for 2 days longer, or Christmas week, we didn't check cultures Christmas Day on a Thursday. So if you moldy on a Friday, now your moldies are failing and everyone's frustrated, right? So all of that is really playing an impact. So I think we have to develop tools and extraction methods that sort of get us past that and are not so variable, because our lab has to be more fluid than that. But I'll keep you updated if we find a better method. You have a question?
Hi. So I saw that you had a chart where you said that dermatophytes are not normally sent out to susceptibility testing, but I do remember that I think it was like about 3 years ago there was some talk about trichophyton and mentagrophytes
Yeah.
going crazy.
Yeah.
And I just haven't heard anything about that since. So I wanted to know if it ended
You
in
see it?
anything interesting.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It's trichophyton mentagrophytes and trichophyton indotinae that's been shown to be resistant to terbinafine. It was believed that this was not an issue within the U.S. because, for example, India, where I come from, we used to have a cream called Fair and Lovely. My mom used to use it, and we just thought this was just a nice cream, right? And it's because they prefer fairer skin. So these creams have steroids to essentially make your skin lighter. And because of the steroid use and the availability of antifungals without prescriptions, sort of it's not a great combo. So because of that, we thought all of these dermatophyte infections are also very common there because of the humid weather, the heat. All of those things sort of contribute to having more dermatophyte infections. So it was believed that this was limited to certain parts of the world. However, that was not the case because when they sequenced isolates within the US reference labs, they found that some of the isolates even within the US were resistant to terbinafine. And so now we've actually changed practice in our lab where we actually stock every trichophyton if it comes from a skin. And that way, anything that is not, because they start terbinafine before we even get a trichophyton isolated, right? But if they're refractory to treatment, then we at least have an isolate that we can send out for susceptibility testing. So I think it exists. I think it's a larger issue in certain parts of the U.S., like New York, where they've made it a routinely available test where they'll do terbinafine agar testing for every trichophyton that comes through. There's also some easier tests where they say you can test for urease, and if it's urease positive, then it most likely is, trichophyton indotinae, and then might be resistant to terbinafine. So it still exists. It's sort of the hype, and then it's just there. Yep.
Boy, that was fun. That's awesome. Our good buddy Canada Auris. So correct me if I'm wrong, but did you say that you don't perform surveillance testing?
We do not perform surveillance testing.
Okay, so we perform surveillance, but only on very specific populations. How does that lay with your infection prevention personnel?
It's an interesting question because actually the non-surveillance is a push from our infection prevention personnel.
I was going to say ours too.
Yeah?
They don't want to know. We offered to do it.
Yeah.
And they don't want to know.
Yeah.
Don't talk to my people then.
Yeah.
We're one big happy family now, so.
No, and really where we're seeing it when we do get sort of this, huge breakout of Candida auris, because it does get notified up, which we might have to change based on the number of notifications we're getting. But when we see it and try to find the common thread, it tends to be limited to nursing homes and things like that. So it's hard because what do you do? And some people believe that it causes more damage to know it's Candida auris. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to put all of these precautions in the patients now. So our infection prevention just doesn't want it. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions online?
Marie Claire from Zoom says, do you have any thoughts on yeast colonization since this is a major factor in transmission of C. auris?
Colonization. Sorry, can you read the question again?
Do you have any thoughts on yeast colonization since this is a major factor in the transmission of C. auris?
Yeah, I can tell you right now, most of our Candida auris that we're seeing, at least in our lab, is literally colonization. That's where we're recovering it. We've so much so that we've had conversations with our pharmacy that do we really need to perform susceptibility testing on all of our Candida aurises given the exponential increase. But yeah, I mean, there's colonization. It plays a factor in Candida auris, is probably playing a factor in a lot of our other Candidas that we're seeing too. Yeah, I wish I could get her to expand on the question. I wish she was here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Let's give her a round of applause. All right, thank you to everyone who joined us tonight in person and virtually. And again, thank you, Lisa and Shinogi, for supporting the JAM community. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, February 3rd at UF Health, and the presentation title is We Work Hard, We Play Hard, Gamifying Medical Education. And this will be given by Dr. Kenneth Gavina. And then, of course, for more information, visit the JAM website. All right, have a good night. Oh, please sign in. I only have 3 people here. Please sign in.